In the spring of 1945, as the guns finally fell silent across Europe, the war did not end for everyone. In the rubble of a defeated Reich, a German boy stood alone, too young to understand ideology, old enough to understand hunger. His parents were gone, swallowed by bombing raids and forced marches that left no records behind. Cities lay flattened into gray horizons. Trains no longer ran on schedules, only on desperation. For children like him, peace arrived not as relief but as exposure. There were no uniforms left to fear, only the cold arithmetic of survival. Across Germany and Central Europe, millions of children drifted through the wreckage. They slept in abandoned factories, scavenged in fields stripped bare, and learned quickly which roads brought food and which brought danger. Aid organizations were overwhelmed. Borders shifted faster than supplies could follow. For a child, the war's end removed structure without restoring safety. Survival became instinctive, learned in silence, practiced daily. No speeches marked this moment. No victory parades reached them. Only the long, uncertain morning after catastrophe. The irony was that this boy's fate would turn not on nationality or allegiance, but on timing. Somewhere between one ruined town and the next, he crossed paths with an occupying American soldier, one of thousands tasked with restoring order to a continent that barely resembled itself. The soldier had rations, authority, and a mandate to move forward. The boy had neither name nor destination. In another year, in another place, they might never have noticed each other. But history had narrowed their world to a single encounter. Before that moment, the boy endured what many did. He walked through towns reduced to outlines where churches stood roofless and schools were piles of brick. Food was scavenged or begged for. Nights were spent listening, to boots, to engines, to the wind passing through shattered windows. Trauma did not announce itself. It settled quietly, shaping memory before language could name it. Yet even here, hope persisted, not as optimism, but as motion. He kept moving because stopping meant disappearing. What began as a story of endurance was already becoming something else. Survival alone would not define his future. Connection, unexpected, fragile, and human, waited just beyond the next mile of broken road. And in the chaos of occupation, one small decision by a stranger would begin a chain of events no one on that road could yet foresee. By the time the American soldier saw the boy, he had already seen too much. He had marched through surrendered cities, processed columns of prisoners, and watched civilians emerge from cellars with the careful movements of people relearning daylight. Children were not unusual. Orphans were everywhere. Yet something in this meeting stood apart, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet. The boy stood near the edge of a road used by military trucks, thin, alert, and unspeaking. He did not beg. He watched. The soldier's world was governed by orders, ration counts, and the slow, methodical work of occupation. He had been trained to identify threats, not futures. Language separated them, as did uniforms and memory. And yet, when the soldier offered food, the boy did not reach for it immediately. He waited, measuring intention in a world where trust had become dangerous. In that pause, something shifted. It was not sympathy alone, it was recognition. The irony of their bond lay in its simplicity. The war had reduced adults to roles: enemy, ally, victor, defeated. But here, those categories fell away. A child and a soldier stood outside the grand narratives of strategy and surrender. One had survived by obedience, the other by adaptability. Neither could undo what had been lost, yet both understood without words what continued absence would mean. Helping the boy was not a simple act. Regulations governed movement, supplies were counted. Compassion was unofficial and often discouraged. The soldier risked reprimand by offering more than a single meal, guidance, protection, a place near safety. Each decision required calculation. Each kindness carried consequence. In a landscape still unstable, mercy demanded courage of a different kind. What neither of them could know was how enduring this moment would become. This was not charity measured in days or weeks. It was the beginning of a responsibility that would outlast uniforms and borders. The boy would remember the soldier not as a representative of an army, but as the first adult who chose him after the war had ended. And as occupation forces moved on and headlines shifted elsewhere, this single encounter quietly set in motion a relationship that history would never record, but would never truly forget. The decision was not made in a single moment. It arrived slowly, formed in the accumulation of small acts, shared meals, guarded sleep, quiet presence. Yet when the American soldier finally understood what he was choosing, the weight of it was unmistakable. To adopt a German child in 1945 was not an act anticipated by military manuals or occupation policy. It invited scrutiny from superiors, suspicion from peers, and confusion from institutions designed to move people along, not bind them together. In the months after the war, adoption across national lines was rare and often discouraged. War orphans were typically processed through relief agencies, assigned to temporary homes, or left to navigate overstretched systems that prioritized efficiency over attachment. For an American serviceman to claim responsibility for a former enemy's child disrupted every assumption of the time. It blurred the line between victor and vanquished, between duty and defiance. The belief that such bonds were impractical, perhaps even disloyal, was widespread. The irony was difficult to ignore. The soldier had been trained to follow orders without hesitation, to view the world through maps and objectives. Yet here in the war's aftermath, he chose an allegiance no command had issued. Family replaced flag. Compassion replaced procedure. In making that choice, he stepped outside the clarity of military life and into uncertainty, where outcomes could not be predicted and protection could not be guaranteed. Obstacles appeared immediately. Paperwork stalled. Permissions contradicted one another. Language differences complicated every interview and form. Cultural suspicion lingered on both sides of the Atlantic. The boy's future depended on signatures from offices still learning how to function after collapse. Each delay carried the risk of separation. Each rule, followed too strictly, threatened to undo what had already taken shape between them. What carried them through was not authority, but persistence. The soldier argued, waited, returned, and refused to let the boy disappear into a system built for numbers rather than names. In doing so, he demonstrated a different kind of courage, one that sought no recognition. And as the machinery of occupation slowly turned, this improbable family began to move forward, into a life neither war nor policy had planned, but history had quietly allowed. By late 1945, the war's geography had shifted from battlefields to corridors, rail lines, ports, and offices where papers determined futures. The American soldier now faced a task no less demanding than any campaign he had known, carrying a child safely from the ruins of Europe to a distant, unfamiliar country. The belief that this journey was possible rested on fragile assurances, temporary documents, stamped permissions, and the soldier's own insistence that the boy belonged with him. The first obstacles were administrative. Travel passes expired without warning. Officials questioned authority, intent, and precedent. Each checkpoint required explanation. Each delay reopened the possibility of separation. Europe was still fractured, its infrastructure strained by displacement on a continental scale. Trains ran irregularly. Ships were overcrowded with soldiers returning home and refugees searching for beginnings. The boy, unused to stability, learned to wait, on platforms and offices beside packed crates of other people's lives. The shock of departure came not with spectacle but with silence. As they boarded a transport ship, the boy left behind a continent that had known him only as a survivor. The sea crossing was long and unsettled. For the child, the horizon erased familiar landmarks, replacing them with motion and uncertainty. For the soldier, responsibility deepened with every mile. There would be no return to Europe if this failed. The choice was now irreversible. The irony of the journey was unmistakable. The boy's survival no longer depended on grand strategies or armies moving across maps. It depended on one man's resolve, his willingness to advocate, to translate, to shield. In a world rebuilt by institutions, this passage forward was powered by something smaller and more durable: commitment. Arrival in the United States introduced new challenges. Language fractured communication. Customs felt unfamiliar and often overwhelming. The boy encountered abundance without context, food that required no ration card, streets untouched by war. Yet safety did not immediately mean belonging. He struggled with words, with routines, with the absence of everything he had known. The soldier, now a guardian in a civilian world, learned patience of a different kind. What bound them during this transition was shared effort. Each misunderstanding corrected, each night endured, strengthened a quiet trust. The journey had not ended at the shoreline. It continued in classrooms, kitchens, and conversations shaped by translation and time. And as they moved forward together, neither could yet see how this passage, from ruin to refuge, would shape the rest of their lives, long after the war itself faded into memory. The boy's first days in America unfolded with fanfare. There were no ceremonies to mark his arrival, no banners or speeches. Yet the contrast was immediate and disorienting. Streets were intact. Buildings stood whole. Stores displayed food in quantities that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. For a child raised amid scarcity and ruin, abundance carried its own shock. Safety felt unreal, as though it might vanish without warning. Adjustment did not come easily. Language stood between him and nearly every interaction. Simple tasks, school lessons, conversations at the table, instructions from teachers, required translation and patience. Customs followed rhythms he did not yet understand. In Germany, survival had been instinctive and immediate. In America, life moved according to schedules and expectations. The belief that a child could simply adapt underestimated the quiet labor required to rebuild a sense of self. The irony of his new life was profound. He had been orphaned by a war fought in his name, but never by his choosing. Now he was cared for by a man who had worn the uniform of the victorious side. What politics had divided, circumstance had reunited in unexpected form. The soldier did not erase the boy's past, he made room for it. Meals were shared without interrogation. Nights passed without sirens. Stability arrived gradually, through repetition rather than declaration. Yet the struggle remained. Trauma does not dissolve at a border. The boy carried memories that surfaced without warning, loud noises, sudden silences, the instinct to hoard food. School presented new challenges. Other children asked questions he could not answer easily. Teachers recognized intelligence shaped by disruption. Progress was uneven, measured in small victories. A new word learned, a full night's sleep, laughter that came unprompted. What sustained this transition was consistency. The soldier, now a father in practice if not by blood, provided boundaries and reassurance. He corrected gently. He waited. Trust, once broken by war, was rebuilt through presence. Over time, the boy began to understand that this life was not temporary, that he would not be sent away, that belonging did not require explanation. The revelation, slow and enduring, was that family could be chosen. That care could cross borders more effectively than armies ever had. And as the boy grew into this new world, the meaning of survival shifted, from endurance alone to the possibility of becoming something more. What neither yet knew was how far that possibility would carry them in the years that followed. Parenthood did not arrive for the soldier with ceremony or instruction. It emerged through routine, meals prepared, school forms signed, hands held while crossing streets. The belief that he could guide a child shaped by war required patience he had never been trained to develop. Combat had taught him how to act under pressure. Fatherhood asked something quieter: consistency, restraint, and the willingness to remain present when there was nothing to fix immediately. What surprised him most was the boy's resilience. Adaptation came unevenly, but it came. The child learned quickly, absorbing language and custom with an intensity forged by necessity. He asked questions with precision, observed adults carefully, and noticed inconsistencies others overlooked. At times, this adaptability impressed the soldier. At others, it unsettled him. Strength built in crisis carried its own costs. The boy's maturity revealed how much childhood had already been surrendered. The irony was unmistakable. The soldier had once measured success by objectives reached and enemies neutralized. Now his purpose was measured in growth, report cards, steady sleep, moments of laughter unburdened by fear. He had crossed an invisible boundary, leaving behind the clarity of command for the ambiguity of care. In doing so, he discovered that protection did not require force. It required attention. Struggle remained a constant companion. Cultural misunderstandings surfaced in small ways: discipline, expectations, expressions of affection. The boy carried habits shaped by loss, reacting sharply to raised voices or sudden change. There were moments of tension when neither fully understood the other. Healing did not progress in a straight line. Some nights were restless. Some days ended in silence, yet neither retreated. What sustained them was mutual effort. The soldier learned to listen more than instruct. The boy learned that anger did not mean abandonment. Trust formed slowly, reinforced through repetition rather than reassurance. Shared experiences, school events, holidays, ordinary afternoons created a framework where memory could be reshaped. War receded, not erased, but contextualized. In time, the soldier's identity transformed. He no longer introduced himself by rank or service record. His sense of purpose no longer depended on uniform or orders. He had become something war rarely allows: a guardian shaping a future wrath. Than surviving a present, the boy in turn gained not only safety but direction, someone who expected him to grow, not merely endure. The revelation was quiet and enduring. Their bond was not born of blood or nation, but of choice sustained over time. And as the years passed, the line between rescuer and rescued blurred, each having given the other a life that neither could have imagined when the war first ended. As the boy grew, the war receded from daily conversation but not from identity. Childhood in America offered stability, schools with intact walls, lessons that assumed continuity, futures described without hesitation. Yet beneath that surface ran an undercurrent shaped elsewhere. He spoke English with increasing fluency, but another language lingered in memory, attached to early instincts and half-remembered places. The struggle was not between loyalty and gratitude, but between inheritance and adaptation. He was becoming American without ceasing to be something else. His German heritage was not erased, it was carried quietly. Certain foods evoked places he could not fully recall. Certain sounds, church bells, trains, the cadence of spoken German, stirred emotions that arrived without explanation. In classrooms, history lessons described the war in simplified terms. Dates and maps replaced lived experience. He listened carefully, aware that his own story did not fit easily into the margins of textbooks. Belonging, he learned, could be conditional. The irony of his life was unmistakable. War had stripped him of family, nation, and certainty, yet through that loss came safety, education, and opportunity. He grew up with access to books, mentors, and a future shaped by choice rather than necessity. What violence had destroyed, love had rebuilt, slowly, imperfectly, but decisively. The contrast did not diminish the past, it reframed it. Adolescence intensified these tensions. Identity sharpened into question. Where did he come from? What did he owe the country of his birth, and what did he owe the one that raised him? At times, he felt the pressure to explain himself, to classmates, to teachers, even to strangers who noticed his accent fading but not fully gone. Cultural differences surfaced in subtle ways: humor, discipline, expressions of emotion. None were insurmountable, but all required navigation. The soldier, now fully a father, did not attempt to resolve these questions for him. Instead, he provided space. He encouraged education not as assimilation, but as empowerment. He spoke honestly about the war without romanticism or apology. He allowed the boy's past to exist without defining his limits. In doing so, he offered something rare: permission to be complex. That foundation mattered. When challenges arose, as they inevitably did, the boy did not face them alone. He learned resilience without hardness, confidence without denial. Academic success followed, not because adversity had vanished, but because it had been met early with guidance rather than neglect. Opportunity did not arrive by chance. It was cultivated through years of consistent care. Over time, the space between worlds became less a fault line and more a bridge. The boy learned to translate not only language but perspective. He understood how fear shaped nations and how mercy reshaped individuals. His upbringing did not erase the war's mark, it transformed it into awareness. He carried history not as burden but as context. The revelation, seen only in hindsight, was that the soldier's greatest act had not been rescue, but preparation. By choosing to raise rather than simply save, he had given the boy tools to navigate a world still shaped by conflict. Identity, once fractured, became layered rather than divided. And as the boy stepped into adulthood, standing between memory and possibility, it became clear that the war had not ended his story. It had merely set the conditions under which a very different one could begin. Time did what war could not. It introduced distance, not of geography, but of perspective. As the boy entered adolescence, the relationship that had once been defined by protection and dependence encountered new strain. Questions replaced certainties. Ambition began to assert itself. The shock was subtle but unmistakable. The child who had once clung to safety now pushed against it, testing boundaries that had been built to protect him. This was not unusual, yet for both father and son the stakes felt higher. Their bond had been forged under extraordinary circumstances, shaped by loss, rescue, and shared survival. The belief that such a bond could withstand ordinary pressures was reassuring, but unproven. Adolescence introduced a different battlefield, one without clear rules. Independence demanded space. Authority invited challenge. Neither had a template for what came next. The irony lay in contrast. War had taught them clarity. Danger had simplified choices. Peace, by comparison, was complex. Expectations multiply. Society offered definitions of success that did not account for origins shaped by displacement and recovery. The boy faced pressures to excel, to define himself not merely as a survivor, but as something more. The father, watching, struggled to balance guidance with restraint. Protection, once physical, now became emotional and far more difficult to calibrate. Misunderstandings emerged in small moments. Conversations ended too quickly. Silences lingered. The boy sought autonomy, sometimes mistaking distance for freedom. The father, mindful of everything that had nearly been lost, worried about risks invisible to youthful confidence. Their disagreements were not loud, but they were persistent. Each reflected a deeper question: how much of the past should shape the future? Societal pressures amplified these tensions. The boy navigated expectations shaped by a country that had offered opportunity but demanded conformity. He was no longer visibly different, yet he carried history others could not see. The father understood this more than most, but even understanding did not guarantee agreement. Love, they discovered, did not eliminate conflict. It gave it meaning. What sustained them through these years was memory, not nostalgia, but awareness. Both remembered what absence felt like. Both knew the cost of abandonment. When distance threatened to harden into division, that shared knowledge pulled them back. Conversations resumed. Compromises formed. Trust, once foundational, became intentional. The revelation came gradually. Their bond did not weaken under pressure. It matured. The boy learned that independence did not require rejection. The father learned that guidance did not require control. Each adjusted expectations shaped by earlier necessity. They encountered one another anew, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two individuals bound by choice rather than circumstance. Over time, ambition found direction rather than resistance. The boy pursued goals informed by opportunity, not driven by fear. The father supported without overshadowing. Their relationship settled into something quieter and more resilient, a partnership marked by respect earned rather than assumed. In the end, what war had accelerated, time refined. The bond that began amid chaos proved capable of endurance in calm. Tested not by danger but by growth, it revealed its true strength, not in how tightly it held, but in how well it adapted. And as years continued to unfold, it became clear that what they had built together was not fragile. It was elastic, able to stretch, to absorb strain, and to endure long after the echoes of war had faded from view. The past did not remain buried simply because time advanced. For both father and son, memory surfaced in fragments, unannounced and persistent. The struggle was no longer survival in a literal sense, but reckoning. The soldier carried recollections of marches, ruined towns, and choices made under orders that no longer applied. The son carried impressions formed before language, fear without narrative, loss without explanation. Together, they faced a shared inheritance shaped by war, even as their lives moved further from it. Conversations about the past emerged gradually. They were not prompted by anniversaries or ceremonies, but by ordinary moments, a newsreel, a classroom assignment, a question asked too carefully to be casual. The soldier spoke without embellishment. He described events precisely, refusing to romanticize violence or soften consequence. The son listened not as a student of history, but as someone seeking coherence. In these exchanges, the war became less abstract and more human, anchored to experience rather than ideology. The irony was unmistakable. Their bond had been forged not through tradition or bloodline, but through shared exposure to danger and uncertainty. What conventional upbringing often assumes, continuity, inheritance, shared background, had been replaced by something else, mutual survival. They understood one another not because their lives had been easy, but because both had been shaped by rupture. This understanding required no explanation. It operated beneath language. At times, memory tested them. Certain recollections reopened wounds rather than closing them. The son confronted questions of identity that could not be answered cleanly. The soldier confronted regrets that could not be revised. Yet even here, they did not turn away. Facing the past together transformed memory from burden into reference. It became something that informed decisions rather than dictated them. Their shared history fostered a strength that revealed itself in unexpected ways. When confronted with prejudice or misunderstanding, the son responded with patience rather than defensiveness. He had learned early that fear often precedes judgment. When the soldier encountered uncertainty in civilian life, he drew confidence not from authority, but from resilience already proven. Each had witness. The other endured circumstances that required adaptation beyond comfort. What emerged was a quiet model of connection, one not built on sameness but on recognition. Nationality became secondary to character. Conflict became context rather than definition. The soldier did not ask the son to forget where he came from. The son did not ask the soldier to justify the past. They accepted complexity as a condition of truth. This bond carried implications beyond their household. Friends, teachers, and later colleagues observed a relationship shaped by mutual respect rather than obligation. It challenged assumptions about loyalty and belonging. Here was a family formed not by heritage, but by decision, sustained by accountability rather than expectation. In a world eager for clear categories, their connection resisted simplification. The revelation, clear only with distance, was that their strength lay not in overcoming difference, but in integrating it. The war that had once separated nations had, through an improbable sequence of choices, united two lives across its deepest divides. Their relationship did not erase history. It demonstrated how history could be carried without perpetuating its harm. As years passed, the details of the war faded from daily relevance, but its lessons endured, tempered by reflection and guided by care. The soldier and his son moved forward not as symbols, but as individuals whose shared past informed a durable present. And in that shared strength, forged under circumstances neither had chosen, they offered a quiet testament. That human connection, when sustained by courage and honesty, can outlast the forces that once made it seem impossible. In adulthood, reflection arrived not as nostalgia, but as reckoning. The boy, now a man, looked back across decades and recognized the scale of what had been done for him. What once felt ordinary now revealed itself as extraordinary. The sacrifices of the man who adopted him had been quiet, sustained, and absolute. No single gesture defined them. They accumulated over time, shaping a life that might otherwise have remained fractured by war's aftermath. As a child, he had understood safety without fully understanding its source. As an adult, he traced that safety to specific choices, a decision made on a ruined road, persistence through unyielding bureaucracy, years of patient guidance. The belief that his trajectory from orphan survivor to stable adulthood had been contingent on one soldier's courage was not sentimental. It was factual. Without that intervention, his future would have followed a far narrower path. The irony of their relationship sharpened with distance. The man who had crossed an ocean to fight enemies defined by uniform and nation had become the child's most steadfast ally. War had framed his early purpose. Peace had revealed a deeper one. In caring for a child once labeled enemy, he undermined the very categories war depends upon. Loyalty, he demonstrated, could be directed toward humanity rather than abstraction. Their relationship changed as time progressed. Authority softened into counsel. Dependence gave way to mutual regard. Conversations between them grew reflective rather than directive. The turning point was not marked by a single event, but by recognition. Each saw the other as an equal participant in a shared story. Respect replaced obligation. Admiration replaced gratitude. What remained was familial love, chosen and reaffirmed rather than assumed. They shared milestones, graduations, career beginnings, quiet evenings shaped by familiarity rather than necessity. The soldier, now aging, observed the life that had unfolded from his choice with a restraint shaped by humility. He did not claim credit. The son, aware of the full weight of his past, did not withhold it. Their bond did not require constant affirmation. It was evident in absence as much as presence. In moments of reflection, the son understood that adversity had been the forge, not the definition. What endured was not trauma but connection. The war had introduced them, commitment had sustained them. That distinction mattered. It reframed the narrative from rescue to relationship, from survival to continuity. The revelation extended beyond their private lives. Their story illustrated a truth often lost in the scale of history, that individual choices carry consequences as enduring as any policy or campaign. Nations record battles and treaties. Lives are shaped by decisions made without witnesses. The soldier's courage had not altered the war's outcome. It had altered a life's direction irreversibly. As years passed, the son carried this understanding forward. It informed how he approached responsibility, how he measured loyalty, how he responded to vulnerability in others. Legacy, he realized, was not inherited solely through blood or name. It was transmitted through action, sustained through presence, and remembered through impact. When the soldier eventually receded into memory, the absence was profound but not hollow. What remained was guidance internalized, values demonstrated, and a life lived with awareness of how fragile and how durable human bonds can be. The final irony was simple and enduring. A war designed to divide the world had, through a single act of compassion, created a family that outlasted its violence. And in that intertwining of lives, history found one of its quiet victories, unrecorded, uncelebrated, and entirely real. Life did not settle into ease simply because the war had ended or because one childhood had been saved. Challenges continued, arriving in forms less visible than hunger or displacement, but no less demanding. Careers introduced uncertainty. Relationships required patience. Loss returned in quieter ways. Through each of these passages, the connection between father and son did not diminish. It adapted. Shared milestones became markers of endurance. Graduations earned, homes established, moments of pride observed from the edges rather than the center. The son's achievements were never isolated events. They were witnessed, supported, and contextualized by a man who understood how fragile opportunity could be. Each success carried echoes of an earlier rescue, though neither framed it that way. The soldier did not remind the son of what had been done for him. The son did not measure his life as repayment. What sustained them was mutual presence, offered without accounting. The irony of their story sharpened with time. A single intervention during war, brief, almost incidental in the scope of history, had ignited decades of guidance and care. What began as protection matured into mentorship. What began as responsibility became pride. The soldier, once defined by service abroad, found lasting purpose in the quiet labor of fatherhood. The son, once defined by loss, discovered identity through continuity. Time itself marked the turning point. Years accumulated not as erosion, but as reinforcement. Distance did not weaken their bond, it clarified it. Periods apart underscored permanence rather than absence. They returned to one another not out of obligation, but choice. Conversations evolved, shaped by reflection rather than urgency. The immediacy of survival gave way to deliberation, how to live well, how to be useful, how to remain humane. Family events revealed the depth of their connection. Gatherings were unremarkable to outsiders. Shared meals, exchanged glances, traditions carried forward. Yet beneath these ordinary scenes lay extraordinary context. Two lives once joined by necessity now moved together by commitment. The soldier observed generations extend beyond himself. The son recognized lineage formed through care rather than blood. History, once disruptive, became integrative. Struggle remained part of the landscape. Illness arrived. Careers faltered. Grief resurfaced as those who remembered the war firsthand began to disappear. Yet even in these moments, their relationship provided orientation. They understood that endurance did not mean stoicism. It meant remaining engaged. Supporting one another through decline required as much courage as rescue once had. The revelation, clear only after decades, was that true family is constructed rather than assumed. It is built through trust renewed daily, through courage applied repeatedly in ordinary circumstances. Emotional investment, unlike obligation, deepens over time. The soldier's initial act of compassion had not ended when the boy reached safety. It had expanded into guidance, into shared memory, into legacy. As the soldier aged, the son assumed responsibilities once carried for him. Roles reversed without ceremony. Care flowed in both directions. What had begun as protection became reciprocity. This transition was neither tragic nor sentimental. It was the natural completion of a bond sustained long enough to mature fully. In the final measure, their decades together testified to something history rarely records. That compassion, when acted upon and maintained, does not fade. It multiplies. Its shapes lives long after headlines disappear. The war that had once defined them receded into background, replaced by a narrative of continuity. And in that continuity, quiet, resilient, and deeply human, their connection endured as proof that the most lasting victories are not claimed on battlefields, but lived out across a lifetime. The true impact of the soldier's choice did not reveal itself immediately. It unfolded slowly across decades, long after uniforms were folded away and the war receded into archives. What had begun as a single act of responsibility continued to resonate, first within one life, then within a family, and eventually across generations. The shock lay not in the act itself, but in its endurance. Few decisions made in wartime survive peace intact. This one did. As years passed, the story was told not as legend, but as fact, quietly, without embellishment. Children and grandchildren learned that their family existed because one man refused to look away. The soldier's choice became a reference point, a reminder that history is not only shaped by strategy and command, but by individuals willing to accept moral weight without expectation of recognition. The war explained the circumstances. It did not explain the outcome. The irony remained central. A moment born of violence and collapse produced a lifetime defined by care and continuity. From a battlefield environment where efficiency and survival governed every action emerged a decision that defied those principles entirely. It was inefficient, it was risky, and yet it proved durable. What the war destroyed in scale, compassion rebuilt in detail. Over time, the story traveled beyond the family itself. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances encountered it not as inspiration, but as evidence. It challenged assumptions about loyalty, nationality, and identity. Here was proof that empathy could cross the most rigid boundaries war erects. The turning point was not public recognition or formal acknowledgement. It was influence, the subtle way the story altered how others perceived responsibility toward strangers. The adopted son, now fully aware of the magnitude of his past, carried the story with restraint. He did not frame it as miracle or exception. He presented it as consequence. This happened because someone acted. In doing so, he honored the soldier not by elevating him beyond humanity, but by placing him firmly within it. Courage, the story suggested, was not rare because it was unattainable, but because it was often deferred. The revelation deepened with time. Acts of kindness, especially those undertaken in moments of chaos, do not remain isolated. They generate momentum. They shape values. They alter how future decisions are made. The soldier's action influenced how the son approached responsibility, how he treated vulnerability, how he responded to injustice. These choices, in turn, informed the lives around him. The ripple widened, quiet but persistent. War often teaches societies what they are capable of destroying. This story taught something else, what they are capable of preserving. It demonstrated that humanity does not vanish under pressure. It reveals itself selectively through those willing to act without assurance of outcome. The soldier did not know the future he was securing. He knew only the immediate cost of inaction. In the final measure, the story resisted simplification. It was not redemption for war, nor proof of its necessity. It was a counterpoint, a reminder that even amid organized violence, individual morality retains agency. History records battles won and lost. It rarely records the moments that prevented lives from disappearing quietly into statistics. The soldier's legacy was not carved into stone or commemorated by ceremony. It lived on in relationships, in choices repeated, in lives shaped by the knowledge that someone once intervened when indifference would have been easier. That knowledge became inheritance. The lasting irony is this: wars are remembered for what they take, but this war, through one decision, became remembered for what it gave. And in that contrast lies the story's final truth. Compassion does not end conflict, but it ensures that conflict does not have the final word. They fought once, but what endured was the choice to care, and the generations shaped by it. The consequences of the soldier's decision extended far beyond what either man could have imagined at the moment it was made. One act of courage altered the course of a single life, but its influence did not stop there. It moved outward, quietly, persistently, shaping families, values, and choices long after the original circumstances had faded from view. History often measures impact in numbers. This impact was measured in continuity. The child who had once walked through ruined towns grew into an adult capable of stability, contribution, and care. That transformation was not abstract. It affected how he raised his own family, how he approached responsibility, how he responded to others in moments of need. The soldier's decision became embedded in behavior rather than memory. Compassion, once received, became something to be practiced. The irony at the center of this story remained unresolved and instructive. War exists to impose force, to divide populations, to reduce lives to objectives. Yet within that same environment, it can expose the starkness of moral choice. The very conditions that normalized destruction also clarified the cost of indifference. The soldier's act did not redeem the war. It stood apart from it, a refusal to allow violence to dictate the entirety of human behavior. As years passed, the story's reach widened. Those who encountered it through family connection or quiet retelling did not encounter it as legend. They encountered it as precedent. It suggested that ethical responsibility does not vanish. Under pressure, that choice remains possible even when circumstances discourage it. This understanding influenced how others viewed their own obligations, particularly toward those displaced, vulnerable, or overlooked. The revelation was not sentimental. Compassion did not solve every problem. It did not undo loss or prevent future suffering. What it did was establish continuity. It ensured that one life did not end in fragmentation. From that continuity emerged stability, education, and opportunity, conditions that allowed subsequent generations to live without the shadow of unresolved displacement. In this way, compassion functioned not as an emotion but as a force multiplier. It shaped outcomes indirectly, through habits and values passed forward. The soldier never met the grandchildren whose lives were made possible by his decision. He did not need to. The ripple did not require acknowledgement to persist. It moved through time regardless of recognition. War narratives often end with surrender or victory. This story extended beyond both. Its true consequence unfolded in the decades that followed, in lives defined not by what they survived, but by what they were able to build. The child's rescue was not the culmination. It was the beginning of a sequence of ordinary, decisive acts carried out in peace. The enduring lesson lay in scale. History emphasizes what nations do. This story emphasized what individuals can preserve. It suggested that the smallest units of moral action, attention, responsibility, refusal to abandon, carry disproportionate weight, especially in moments when systems fail or overwhelm. In the end, the ripple effect was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It simply continued. One decision produced a life. That life produced others. Values demonstrated once became principles repeated. Compassion, enacted under the harshest conditions, proved capable of outlasting them. And so the final consequence was this. A war remembered for its destruction also became the setting for a legacy of care. Not because the war demanded it, but because one person chose, against the prevailing logic of the moment, to see a child not as a remnant of conflict, but as a future worth protecting. Their story never belonged to monuments or memorials. It was not etched into stone or preserved in official histories. There were no medals awarded for what followed, no citations issued for years of quiet devotion. And yet within the vast human wreckage left by the war, few outcomes carried greater meaning. The human element of their bond, unrecorded, uncelebrated, stood as a reminder that history's most enduring forces often operate beyond its attention. The world moved on quickly after the war. Nations rebuilt. Alliances shifted. New conflicts emerged to claim the public imagination. In that movement, individual stories like theirs were absorbed into anonymity. The soldier returned to civilian life without distinction. The child grew into adulthood without headlines. Nothing about their lives suggested exception. And that perhaps was the point. What they achieved together was not extraordinary because it was rare, but because it was possible. The irony remained quietly powerful. A war defined by division, by borders hardened and identities weaponized, had produced a relationship that ignored all of it. Uniform and language, victor and defeated, meant nothing in the private reality they built. What had begun in the shadow of destruction evolved into something deliberately constructive. Where war specialized in separation, this bond insisted on unity, sustained not by ideology but by care. True heroism in their story was never dramatic. It did not arrive in moments of danger, but in long stretches of responsibility. It was found in showing up repeatedly, in choosing patience over convenience, in refusing to allow circumstance to dictate moral distance. Love, as they practiced it, was not declared. It was enacted daily, quietly, and without witnesses. The revelation, visible only with perspective, was how invisible such bonds often remain. History tends to preserve acts that alter borders or end conflicts. It rarely preserves acts that prevent lives from dissolving into absence. Yet the impact of those acts is no less real. The soldier's choice did not alter the outcome of the war. It altered the meaning of its aftermath for one child, and for all who followed from that life. In this sense, their bond functioned as a counter-history. It resisted the idea that violence defines eras absolutely. It suggested instead that within even the most destructive moments, individuals retain agency, that the capacity to care is not extinguished by scale or sanctioned brutality. The war created the conditions. The soldier made the decision. The bond endured because it was maintained. Those who later encountered their story often missed its significance at first. There was no spectacle to frame it, no tragedy resolved in a single arc. Its power lay in duration. Decades of mutual presence carried more weight than any moment of rescue alone. The soldier did not save the boy once. He continued to choose him year after year. That repetition, more than the original act, defined the relationship. The unsung nature of their bond does not diminish it. It clarifies it. It reveals how much of human progress depends on actions that never seek recognition. How many lives are quietly redirected by people who do not consider themselves heroes? Love in this form does not announce itself. It leaves evidence instead, in stability, in continuity, in lives that do not end where they might have. In the end, their story stands not as an exception, but as an invitation. A reminder that history is not only shaped by forces beyond control, but by choices made within reach. That even in war's aftermath, connection remains possible. That the most profound victories are often personal, enduring, and unseen. They were never celebrated, but they endured. And in that endurance, the war failed to have the final word. At the war's end, the boy had stood alone in a landscape stripped of certainty. He possessed no documents that promised a future, no family to anchor him to place or name. He was one among millions displaced by forces too vast to resist. History would have accepted his disappearance without pause. That was the scale of the devastation. Yet against that scale, one soldier made a choice that refused anonymity. From that refusal, a life was rebuilt. The moral closure of this story lies not in rescue alone, but in what followed. The soldier did not save the boy and move on. He stayed. He assumed responsibility long after the urgency faded. In doing so, he transformed an act of compassion into a lifelong commitment. The boy gained more than safety. He gained continuity, a family structure capable of carrying memory, identity, and hope forward. This outcome was never inevitable. Systems designed to manage post-war chaos could have absorbed the child and dispersed him elsewhere. Bureaucracy could have prevailed. Distance could have intervened. Instead, human connection persisted where policy hesitated. The soldier's courage did not express itself through defiance, but through endurance. He accepted the slow labor of care, the years required to turn survival into belonging. Reflection reveals the deeper truth of their bond. Human connection does more than comfort. It repairs fractures left by violence. It restores dignity where war erodes it. The boy's scars did not vanish. They were integrated into a life shaped by trust rather than fear. Healing arrived not as erasure, but as transformation, pain contextualized by care, loss counterbalanced by presence. The bridge between them spanned divides that history insists are permanent. Nationality, language, allegiance, each had once marked them as adversaries within a global conflict, yet none proved stronger than choice. The soldier did not deny the war's reality. He acted despite it. The boy did not forget where he came from. He grew beyond it. Together, they demonstrated that conflict can shape lives without owning them. Their story endures because it is both intimate and universal. It does not argue that compassion is easy or that war produces goodness. It asserts something quieter and more demanding, that even within destruction, moral agency survives. That individuals retain the power to interrupt cycles of loss. That love, sustained over time, becomes a force history cannot erase. From orphan to son, from soldier to father, the transformation was gradual and deliberate. It unfolded in kitchens and classrooms, in arguments resolved and silences endured. It unfolded in decades rather than moments, and because of that duration, it mattered. The boy did not simply survive the war. He lived a life shaped by guidance, expectation, and care. The soldier did not simply return home. He carried forward a responsibility that defined his legacy. When measured against the enormity of the Second World War, this story seems small. One child, one soldier, no strategic consequence, no alteration of borders. And yet this is precisely why it endures. It reminds us that history's meaning is not confined to outcomes recorded in textbooks. It resides equally in lives preserved from erasure, in futures redirected quietly without witness. In the end, the boy was no longer defined by what he had lost. He was defined by what he was given and by what he carried forward. Family, once destroyed by war, was rebuilt by choice. A future, once uncertain, was secured by commitment. A bond, formed in the aftermath of violence, endured for a lifetime. He was a boy lost to war, but one soldier's courage gave him a family, a future, and a bond that lasted a lifetime. From enemy lines to lifelong family, one boy's life was forever changed by a soldier's heart.